Welcome everyone to this forum. We are actually kicking things off close to on time, which is really fabulous given the vagaries of technology. We are here at what we're calling Finding Balance, How Upstate Can Earn an Equal Voice in Albany. I'm Liz Benjamin. I am the person formerly known as Liz Benjamin, as I like to tell people these days. I used to be the host of Capital Tonight on Spectrum News for many years, and now I am the managing director for Albany for a firm called Marathon Strategies, and we do communications consulting and strategic consulting. So, but you're not here to see me, you're here to see three candidates who are going to have a conversation with us about the importance of upstate and why it needs to be represented, as it is woefully lacking representation right now in Albany. With us, three Democrats: Jim Barber, he's running for the 51st Senate district. I would tell you how many counties that touches, but there are too many of them to name, and there's a lot. These districts are very gerrymandered. As you can see behind Mr. Barber there, he has his district map. Also, Leslie Danks Burke running in the 58th Senate district, and also John Mannion, the 50th Senate district. All these candidates are with us, and I want to thank them so much for being here and having this important conversation, and also thank them for having me play my old role for a little while, which I really appreciate. So thank you very much. I just want to get things started because I think that the current public health crisis that we find ourselves in, which is ongoing, has brought into stark relief the difference between the needs of upstate and downstate when it comes to policy. And of course, there is a precedent that has been set. There are numerous precedents set for regional discretion when it comes to policy. The one that comes to mind most readily is the minimum wage increase, which was enacted regionally, recognizing that the upstate economy is not the same animal as the New York City economy. So I just want to say, as we kick things off here, that this is not a debate, this is a conversation, as noted, and all of you should just have this conversation as if we were talking in a socially distanced, safe manner, 6 feet apart at a table, which we are not, unfortunately, but just sort of chime in when you have something that you want to say. Technically speaking, Mr. Mannion, you're closest to me in the video view here. So okay. I'll go first to you, if you don't mind. If you could just talk about the thus far, the approach you think in addressing the COVID crisis, and whether a more regionally balanced effort would have been appropriate. And again, let's recognize hindsight is 2020. Nobody's dealt with this sort of thing before. We're not necessarily here to point fingers, et cetera, but we should learn from this moment.
Thank you. Yes. Well, my district, just for a little bit of perspective, includes the city, parts of the city of Auburn, and then a small part of the city of Syracuse, which includes several excellent healthcare institutions. So we're fortunate in our area to have that. I do appreciate the approach that was taken at the state level and at the local level here. The virus was taken seriously. I believe that there were proactive steps that were made once it was clear that there were going to be problems in the area. So I think the approach was a good one, and I do think that there was some regional perspective there. I commend the leaders at the state and the local level, because really they have to thread a needle here. They have to apply data, and they did, and that was important. They have an economy that they know is going to be impacted negatively by these shutdowns to try to mitigate as much of the crisis as we could. People were going to be impacted, people were going to get sick, and they were going to die, and that was going to have an awful impact on our area, of course. And then along those lines, in an effort to keep people safe, we had to try to protect our economy in every way that we could. And some areas of the economy actually saw an improvement. That being said, I do think that there was a regional approach here, and data was applied, and that's an important perspective that I took from it. And I commend those people in staying out of trying to dragged into a political debate that happened locally, and it was avoided.
Mr. Barber, do you want to take that one next? I mean, certainly there is. Mr. Mannion's point is well taken. I mean, maybe this is more of a rural versus urban conversation as opposed to an upstate versus downstate conversation. That though there's more rural area in upstate. Last I checked, Manhattan didn't have much in the way of rural space.
No, although there's a farm on Staten Island. So
There, yes, true.
Yeah.
It used to be all farms on Staten Island.
And I think, as you said in the beginning, it's important not to play armchair quarterback on this. The reality is, in the very beginning, we didn't have a lot of data. There wasn't testing, had no idea of the scope and the breadth and scope of the infections within New York and even upstate. So we definitely took the right approach. Let's shut down, get a handle on the situation, see what things are, and then move forward from there as more data, more information was available. Very information-driven process, both shutting down and reopening. So I like the approach, and the reopening really is very regional in approach. I would actually probably prefer a county by county approach, because I don't like being part of a more popular. Some urban areas are going to have different impacts than very rural counties like Schoharie County. But that being said, I did not have access to the data that the decision makers had. So I like the fact that information. They based their approach based on the information that they had.
Ms. Danks Burke.
So I think you're right that this isn't an upstate downstate problem. To me, it's not a Republican Democrat problem. I don't even know if it's a rural urban problem as a planners versus lack of planning. I think we had excellent stewardship through the crisis. I think that you want strong crisis management, and I think we saw that. But what I'm questioning at this point is, what was the planning that went into this in advance? And I'm talking like 5-10 years in advance.
Yeah,
we had a recession back in 2008 that showed that the unemployment system in New York State was not capable of handling recession level load. So we've known that for 12 years, and yet we didn't have planning, to make sure that that was going to be available for people when they faced unemployment again in the next recession. And then I'm also concerned about the planning going forward. And I think that the biggest challenge that we have in upstate, downstate, rural, urban, Democrat, Republican, whatever two groups you want to pit against each other, I think the biggest challenge that we're facing right now is that there's different needs for different populations, and you can't have a one size fits all plan and expect it to work for everyone. And so naturally, if you develop a one size fits all plan, you're going to alienate somebody in that group that doesn't fit. And that's what concerns me the most as far as planning going forward.
Well, to that end, though, I mean, when you talk about planning going forward, I mean, first of all, it's difficult for us to plan going forward from a financial standpoint, which I think we're shifting to, though we're seeing spikes all over the nation, which is very concerning. We're seeing some pinpointed spikes, very concentrated in the state. And I think 2 weeks from July 4th is going to be a real telltale moment. Not being a public health expert.
Just like we saw with Memorial Day, right?
Right. But really what we need to know going forward is financial planning, right? And we don't have any information from DC. So, but why is it important to have more of a robust upstate voice? I mean, right now we've got 3 Democrats in the majority conference. We have Rachel May, we have Tim Kennedy, and we have Neil Breslin. Neil Breslin's in Albany. Some people would quibble as to whether or not he's actually upstate. We are not going to settle the upstate, where does it start thing tonight. So don't even try. We'll get into more trouble than we need. But I think that what can you achieve? And also, even if you're all elected, that's only going to give us 6 upstaters in a downstate dominated conference. And the assembly is downstate dominated too. And so we're going to have a lot of robust conversations, as we've already seen, about rent and the moratorium, which is important to certain areas of upstate too. But what can you do as an upstater if in fact you get elected, and why is that an important thing that constituents should pay attention to?
Well, so one of the things that I think on that economic question is that when you look at the population of New York State and the wealth of New York State, it's concentrated in New York City. I mean, there's no argument about that. And so, for example, in this pandemic that we just started to go through, and that I think we're still going to be going through for quite some time, New York City, with its vast wealth and its many, many people, was able to immediately put in place a small business relief program that addressed the small business needs in New York City. Now, if each municipality in upstate New York was expected to carry that same lift for each one of their individual little cities, they're trying to do that with, you know, a population that is less than 1% of what New York City has to work with. So when you talk about upstate and downstate, right now what happens is we get pitted against each other in sort of a, you know, Hunger Games warfare style, simply because we're geographically spread out. I think what we need to look at is what does a large group of people need? Well, upstate, a large group of people, about 8 million people, really need some attention from the state with respect to small businesses, with our farms, agriculture, our transportation has all gotten left behind.
Yeah, I think it's actually maybe what you're hitting at. It's more demographic than geographic. You have a lot of wealth. You have, you know, different resources, different levels of wealth, different sources of tax revenues in the different areas. So how do you make all that work within the state? So that
and fair taxation is a particular issue for you, is it not, Mr. Barber?
it is. Yes, a huge issue. But again, it is that demographic issue. When the state pushes the cost of Medicaid down onto the counties, where the main source of revenue is the property tax, which has no relation to income, then you have a very unfair tax system. So yeah, we need something that actually statewide addresses the issue of everyone paying what they can afford to pay. And as we mentioned, New York City is a huge financial powerhouse. They can, you know, that sector of New York City can pay a lot more. I'm not talking about all of the city, because they're very poor sectors in the city.
Yeah.
So again, it's really demographics. Let's make sure that the folks who can really afford to pay and are really benefiting, but actually even now during the pandemic, and make sure that we have a system that treats everyone fairly on an income basis.
So are you speaking of an income tax increase then, or specifically, or a revamping of the property tax system, or both?
So what I'm looking at is a way to tax a lot of the financial transactions that occur in the city, investment bankers, all those. There's a lot of loopholes that are and gimmicks that are employed in those areas. As they say, you know, the can't draw a blank on the name right now, but
Well, it's probably because you never qualified for it, Jim.
yeah. So,
Yeah,
but-
right.
but, you know,
You need to make more money, Mr.
Qualified
Barber,
for that.
the
clearly.
investors are paying a much lower percentage of their income than, you know, the working class. You pay a higher
Earned income tax, earned income loophole, right? Yeah,
Right, under right. All that money they're earning is called unearned income. So.
right. It's interesting. I don't know if you've seen, Mr. Mannion, you know, if we end up, we talk about New York City as this massive financial powerhouse, and that's true, but we should also recognize that New York City is being remade before our eyes. The very wealthiest people in the 5 boroughs left. And I don't know that many of them are going to return. I mean, you may very well end up with some downstaters in your district should you be elected to represent your district that you're seeking to represent. I mean, I know that real estate is going gangbusters in the Albany area. People are getting into bidding wars for sight unseen for property that they've never even walked on. So, I mean,
But I think the same point would hold that Jim was making, though, regardless of where they live. Right now, the folks who make less, the middle and lower income across the state, are currently subsidizing the folks at the very tippity top, no matter where they live in the state. And that's a problem. That's the reason our property taxes are through the roof.
so do you think then, I mean, when I mentioned that you've got 3 folks on the Democrat majority from upstate, you also have the Republicans who would argue that they are in fact the voice of upstate, that they always have been the voice of upstate. And until recently, actually, they had a Long Islander as their head of the minority. Now John Flanagan is gone. You have Robert Ort from the Buffalo Niagara area. Is that sufficient, in your opinion, to make a dent in the upstate downstate policy divide?
I'm just going to chime in. This is why the Republicans have been the voice of upstate. They gerrymandered the districts so that they stay in office. I mean, there's a lot. There's certainly plenty of Democrats upstate, and it's more rural. What are the rural values? Not what are the Republican Democratic values. what are the issues that are impacting small cities and farms and rural communities?
Right. Do you think that the current makeup of the majority, in other words, does not sufficiently understand those issues?
I think that as a native Central New Yorker, I believe that we need to have a voice in Albany. You know, I believe the situation in the 50th Senate District right now, it's not a good time to have a vacant seat in the Senate, and at a time where I represent a large area of Onondaga County that has 460,000 citizens, and we fall under the criteria of 500,000 for a stimulus package. That area includes a lot of rural and suburban areas, but also parts of the city of Syracuse. We're kind of getting double whammied here, and you could throw on one other one with the cancellation of the state fair, as far as making sure that we get our fair share and get it back to our area. We have very important institutions here that need help, municipalities that need help. Cayuga County, I've had conversations repeatedly about the AIM funding and how that impacts the city of Auburn. So we're in a situation where locally, I believe I'm a very representative voice of the area. And then also, it's absolutely necessary that I be in that room, that we need someone in the majority to make sure that when that seat sits vacant for what's going to be over a year effectively, that we need a strong voice in the majority that can bring the concerns of the area into that majority conference and help form legislation in a way that's positive for my district and for the rest of upstate. And I think that the Senators Kennedy, May, and Breslin would agree that there needs to be more of that Democratic voice coming from upstate.
Do you feel, though, any of you, and you should just jump right in here, I mean, certainly there are stark differences between, for example, the highest poverty tracts, which I believe are located in the Bronx, and yet some of the highest poverty tracts in the nation when it comes to childhood poverty are in Syracuse. So you can see that there are potentially areas of overlap. I mean, you know, I don't know necessarily that you're going to be able to educate people on, like, you know, cow milking, for example, though I have seen some of the downstate senators take tours of upstate farms, and it's pretty interesting. And I've also seen the Assembly Speaker have a really great time at the fair, which unfortunately this year none of us will be able to do. But I guess the point is, do you see areas of potential agreement? And also, similarly, because it's sort of part of the same question, do you see areas where you would be able to form alliances with the Republicans if necessary, because there still are going to be more of them in the upstate area than there will be Democrats, even if all three of you are successful?
There's absolutely areas of agreement. If you just look at education, for example, the schools that are getting the short end of the stick across the state are the poorer schools, and it doesn't matter what zip code they're in, it's just the poorer schools, right? So there's a huge alliance between low-income districts in New York City, in Syracuse, in Rochester, and then in my district, which is Chemung and Steuben counties, which are dramatically underfunded with respect to their school system. So, you know, it is no child's fault where that child gets born. And right now in New York State, if you get born into a wealthier area, you right from birth, from the get-go, have a real thumb on the scale in favor of your educational opportunities. And that's true across the board, regardless of whether you're in an urban or a rural area.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the trick is finding that common ground, those areas where there's common interest. New York City water comes from upstate, and
yes,
they know it's like the best municipal water system almost in the world, maybe, relying heavily on well-managed farmland, rural properties being in that watershed. So, and you know, we can expand that across the state to understand or really tie it together. The rural and urban areas, we rely on each other. And the city is very concerned about access to nutrition, especially for the poorer residents. You know, New York City, our New York State farmers are very generous in donating for many years. They were the most New York City farmers donated the most produce to the food bank system than any state in the country.
Yeah.
More than California, more than Florida, more than states that produce a lot more than we do. So upstate
actually,
farmers feel a real connection to the community.
Yeah, well, I mean, also ag is, I think, number 3 in our economic domestic product. I don't think people really realize that. When we talk about the economic engine that is New York, we do speak of New York City and the financial sector driving the engine, though there is additional diversity that we didn't have, say, 10 years ago with the tech sector, for example. But ag is still a significant driver and doesn't get its due. But to that end, Mr. Barber, you mentioned, and then Mr. Mannion, both of you, the state has poured in an enormous amount of money investment into the state fair, for example, to improve that facility and make it year round. Of course, this year it's a little bit of difficulty. And then to your point, Mr. Barber, the state also has put quite a bit of effort into connecting upstate farmers with downstate markets, because really that's where the restaurant industry is. That's where the buying power is. And so I guess, do you believe that from an economic standpoint that the governor's put a premium on upstate investment? He said in particular, the Western New York, Buffalo area, and we don't want to delve too deeply into that, but is there enough, do you believe? Because no one ever, let's just be clear, no one ever thinks it's enough, right? Rochester is upset because Buffalo gets more than it's due, and nobody has enough, and certainly there's not going to be enough going forward. We understand that, but has there been an appropriate attention paid through the regional economic development councils, for example, or the Buffalo Billion, or what have you?
So I think he has paid a lot more attention to upstate than many governors, and they have put a lot of resources here. My issue is what is that process? I applaud trying to build infrastructure and systems that help all businesses in upstate New York thrive, and where the reduction in property taxes would help. But when we have a system where you have individual businesses applying for resources and getting tax breaks, you're kind of picking like who is getting that resource instead of let's help everyone across the board. There should be a way where we can just reduce the pressures and restrictions on every business, every sector across the entire state, not cut it up into regions where we're competing with each other for specific prizes. Let's make it a system where everyone can access that influx of wealth. Well, actually, reduce the burden on us, and we'll do it ourselves. So.
Well, and I think that by the same token, we want to make sure that that our sweet spot farms and businesses can compete, right? So there's a certain size of agriculture that is just you can't compete, right? Once you're at a certain small factory, you just can't get out there. And then the big, huge agribusinesses that tend to monopolize agriculture all across the country, they're not really present in New York State right now, right. But they're coming. They're knocking on the door, right? I mean, we see what's happening to the dairy industry. So what I think we need to do is really make sure that we're creating systems that keep those sweet spot ag businesses in business, because that's what we want. We want businesses that are big enough to be successful, but also small enough to be sustainable and not, drive everybody else out of business. So if the state could really begin to prioritize that, you talked about the flow of agriculture from upstate farms to, downstate food pantries or whatever during the pandemic. The biggest problem that we have is a supply chain problem, right? We've got a problem of getting whatever your produce is to the processing facility or accessing the processing facility. If it's, if it's meat, if it's dairy, if it's produce, whatever it is. If we could create opportunities for farmers to be able to access that at the level that they need, that could just open up the economy in a dramatic way. You're not going to be able to do that if you've got each region competing against each other. You have to have sort of a holistic approach to achieve that.
So,
and what really drives the size of the farm is the market they are trying to access. And dairy is, large scale dairy is very, it's going into a wholesale market. So what you see are smaller dairies building their own little niche markets, very small retail markets.
Right.
You're kind of supporting those two ends of the spectrum. The middle is difficult.
Do you
And
think that,
you can see that across all ag spectrums. Sorry.
no, it's okay. Mr. Mannion, to bring you into this a little bit more, do you think that the state needs to rethink its economic development approach? I mean, you know, there's been the regional economic development councils, and there's been this targeted focus, and the governor has said, you know, in the past, well, Buffalo, we ignored Buffalo for so many years, and the disinvestment was obvious in Buffalo, so we really had to double down on Buffalo, for example, right? And then some of the efforts that they've made haven't exactly panned out. I mean, I'm thinking of, you know, some of the tech investment that has been made in the Syracuse area,
Yep.
you know, and the headlines on that have not been positive. So altogether positive, we should say. And yet the investment in the state fairgrounds was a positive outcome. So, I mean, you know, it seems like, you know, they're hitting some out of the park and then they're whiffing on others.
I'm in agreement. Yeah, I've seen it. My area has had to transition away from a manufacturing based economy to more of a service economy focused on healthcare, technology, and education. And honestly, as someone who got out of college in 1990, we really have done a pretty good job of that. But I think I agree with the other candidates that I have seen the good and the bad of it. I think that the process is going to be better moving forward because some of the failures in that process have been so extremely highlighted that I do think there needs to be greater oversight. I think there needs to be greater accountability when jobs are promised or whatever. If we are trying to support these developers and then the promises don't come to fruition, they have to be held accountable. We're in a state where, as it was mentioned previously, you know, we have high property taxes and we have to be prudent with the spending of those tax dollars. So I'm in approval of greater oversight from the comptroller's office. And I do think that moving forward, since a bright light has been shined on the process, that hopefully these plans come through that are well coordinated, well developed, and are long-term. Some of the enhancements that you talked about seem to be short-term enhancements that really provide, you know, maybe aesthetically pleasing looks, but in the long term, there's no real motion behind a transformative economic change for the area.
I don't want to dwell too much on this, but I think it is an important point. I know that in some of our conversations, Ms. Danks Burke brought up, you know, the fact about like sort of Democrat, like big picture Democrats, you know, but when you talk about big picture Democrats, you know, there's a definite difference. I mean, certainly I guess I would ask, is an upstate Democrat and a Brooklyn Democrat the same kind of Democrat? Or do you imagine that, you know, you're going to have social and economic and tax policy differences that's going to be problematic?
I think that the sort of Democrats we need to bring back into the conversation are the FDR Democrats. And when you look at what FDR did, he managed to build a coalition that propped up, you know, working families, city folks, rural agriculture. You had union members, you had working class folks, middle class folks. Back at what happened in the Great Depression, 25% unemployment. That means that 75% of people still had a job.
Mm.
So in that economy, when 75% of people still had a job, we as Americans managed to take care of the 25% who didn't. And that was because of coalition building. Maybe that's a democratic principle writ large. And I think we can bring that back to New York State. And so when you asked, you know, is this a Democrat problem or a Republican problem? Will we be able to work with Republicans? You know, yeah. I look at the last 10 years of New York State, and it has flipped back and forth between Democratic and Republican control, right? The body that the three of us are each seeking to represent our respective districts was held by the Democrats, then by the Republicans for a long time, and now it's back with the Democrats. And we see the same problems, right? Yeah. The problems have changed. During the 10 years that the Republicans were in control, they didn't go away. So I think we need to get back to an FDR style of democracy where we're taking care of the people who are working their hardest to get up the ladder and are being held down right now.
Gentlemen, you want to chime in on that?
In my conversations, particularly with Senator May, who's right next door, but also Senator Kennedy, it's just as simple as being in the room and saying, well, this is how this legislation is going to impact my area.
Mm.
The other senators in the conference, and we know the demographics of the New York City and surrounding areas, that Democrats are going to be elected quite a bit down there, and therefore, that's just the reality of it. If you're in the room and when that legislation is being created, you can say, well, this is how it's going to impact Onondaga County or Cayuga County. And, I hate to use this line, but you only know what you know. And that voice needs to be in that room. It needs to be there to say, well, this is how, when we make these changes in regards to rent or whatever it might be, Syracuse can be very similar to some areas of New York City. And then there can be some stark differences. And in my conversations with the current seated senators and assembly people on the Democratic side, but also on the Republican side, they know that if you're in that majority conference, you've got a voice and you can do something about it. If you're in the other room and you're just going to vote no, then that's not going to help the area.
Yeah, and I think that there's probably also, this is a good chance to remind folks. Albany has changed quite a bit. In the 20 years that I covered it, it changed dramatically, some ways for the better, some ways not so much. But it did, come a long way. But yet it is still a majority rules kind of a place. And so the reality is that if you have a representative who's in the majority in the assembly or in the Senate, your interests are better represented. And that's unfortunate, and perhaps it should not be. And the minority's been railing against that, regardless of if it's Democrats or Republicans for years, but still that's the way it is, unfortunately.
I think going back to the point of, the difference between urban and rural issues, that you got to find those common interests, and just as important, pointing out how that legislation is going to impact rural areas or farmers, how that impact on a farmer is going to impact them in New York City. It's all, it's all tied together. We brought up the water issues. That watershed being enforced is not as effective, as clean as actually being well-managed farmland. You lose farmers, you're going to lose access to that local food system. You need rural areas as partners when we combat climate change. If we move to a green energy economy, you need sustainable economic communities in upstate New York in order to drive that. So there's all common interest. So just being able to make that connection between what impacts upstate is going to impact downstate and vice versa. So, if you're going to make legislation that negatively impacts one or the other, it's going to impact you eventually.
So last I checked, Jim, everybody eats and everybody drinks water.
And everybody pays taxes, usually. Most everybody.
Yeah.
You can't
there's 132 billionaires in New York State who don't pay taxes.
Yeah.
Well, okay, fair enough.
And
so
doesn't pay taxes.
it's amazing how fast an hour goes, but we will get to a point where I want to get to some questions that people submitted, but I do want to talk a little bit about the process by which you hope, get to represent your districts. Of course, is the electoral process, which looks a lot different than it has in years past. And I know your campaigning has looked a lot different because going door to door is a little bit difficult in the pandemic, not advisable. So which is one of the reasons why we're here right now. But I guess I'm curious what you thought of the recent results in the primaries that we saw in June. And also if you have faith in the write-in system, because for example, just this week, if not today, I don't even know that they called it the Albany County DA primary. There were thousands upon thousands of paper ballots that needed to be counted. And it was, it was a close situation. Don't all jump at once. Anybody?
Oh, I think, first of all, I'm surprised that the write-in system produced a greater turnout because I was afraid moving to a write-in system would depress voter turnout, but it was the opposite. So
it's great though.
I'm happy about that. I'm also really in favor of an extended ballot time. You give folks, a week or 5 days over the weekend to vote, because standing in line for, we don't have that problem here, standing in line for 5 hours, but it's crazy. Why do we make it hard to vote?
Well, that could be the topic for a different conversation. We could have Mr. Mannion, I know, would love to have this conversation of why it's so hard to vote and why your district looks as odd as it does.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure which question you want me to answer, but I will chime in on the voting. I think we can all agree that greater participation in government is a good thing. We, our disenfranchised communities, we need to make sure that they're an integral part of the process. And I know that locally, we've made a concerted effort in my campaign and community organizations locally to try to get people signed up to vote. We just went through a primary process during a global pandemic where Board of Elections staff, many of them were working remotely for a very long time, and they pulled it off. These were Republican and Democratic primaries, and the process worked. You don't hear, at least I don't hear, anybody out there crying that we have errors in the system, it's flawed, we can't certify these results.
I can think of one person, but he doesn't live here.
Okay, so, well,
Not
that
anymore,
person,
at any rate.
that person may have voted. That person may have voted by mail, actually. So I just think that if we give the Board of Election staff across the state and across this country the time to make sure that they can properly track these ballots,
Right.
I think they've proven, school districts proved that yes, it can be a bumpy road, but they can pull it off, and there can be a system of checks and balances, and people do trust the system. They've been doing it in other states for years, and I'm supportive of it. And we just did it in a very challenging time, and I think if those Board of Elections offices are prepared, I think it shows that we should all be advocating for greater participation in the voting process and the ease of voting.
Of course, I would point out that it's easier when your party's the one that's growing in numbers to say that you want to have more participation. But to be fair, your districts are currently also gerrymandered to benefit the people who drew those lines, which were the Republicans when they were in power. Another reason why this election matters so significantly, because whoever controls the two chambers is going to control the next round of redrawing those lines. Ms. Danks Burke,
look, conservatives outnumber liberals in my district 1.5 to 1 at least, if not 2 to 1. So, for me to call for increased participation and more vote by mail, I'm bringing 2 people who are more likely to vote against me to the table for every one that I bring of myself. I still think that we, the people in America, deserve to have a voice in our democratic republic, and we're supposed to exercise that voice every single chance we can. So if we've happened upon an opportunity to get more people participating in the process, then by golly, we got to make sure we capitalize on that.
Well, and I'll just say before we move on, I just do want to say voting by mail is no easy thing. I mean, I thought it was just going to be like you just check the box and drop it in the mailbox. No, you have to have somebody watch you. You have to sign the thing. It's people actually really, in other words, they wanted to do it. You have to want to participate, and then you have to put a stamp on it, and then you got to put it in the mail. It's not, it's not exactly as easy as people might make it out to be. So I was impressed that people participated in the numbers that they did, and it was good for, for small d democracy going forward.
As somebody,
yeah, go ahead.
As somebody who was running in a special election for April 28th and had volunteers and myself calling voters and trying to explain that absentee process, I agree with you 100%. And, we all needed a one-pager to clearly explain to those voters, this is how you do it, and you hope that they get it right. But you know what, like anything, if it becomes a common practice, it'll be easy for people to do. Go ahead, Leslie, I apologize.
I've lost my thought. You made such a good point there.
I have that effect on people.
I know what I was going to say.
He renders them speechless. Go ahead.
The piece that I have found the most challenging about running a campaign in a pandemic is, as you pointed out, Liz, that, you can't go door to door. So you don't have this convening opportunity, right? You can't get people together in groups. You can't go visit the Elks Club or go visit the, PTA or whatever it is and chat with folks and hear what their perspectives are. So you're having to do it by Zoom or conference all the time. And what that does is it leaves out anybody who, first of all, doesn't have internet access.
Right.
The huge swath of people across upstate New York who literally don't have access to this basic utility.
Yep.
We're all participating in right now, or people who simply don't have the financial resources to get on or the time resources to get on. So the challenge that we have right now to our democratic republic, I think, is that we are not able to reach each other. We're not able to get to each other and have the sort of conversations that we're supposed to have in order to hash out these problems. And that's what makes me worried for this election cycle, is the folks who are getting left out. And there's a lot of them.
Yeah.
So I don't want to, some of the questions that people submitted, we actually sort of touched on, and I don't want to leave this point because I think it's an important one about rural broadband access. I know that this is something that people feel really passionate about. Some might call it last mile access. You have, it's expensive to connect everyone, and there's a disincentivization for the industry to do it because it's not profitable. But it really, I think this pandemic has laid bare, and you touched on it a little bit there, but if we're going to lean into telehealth and telemedicine the way that I think that we have to, we don't have a choice. Then there really needs to be a concerted effort that everybody's going to be able to get connected and have the kind of care and education that they need. I mean, there's a healthcare shortage in rural New York. I mean, certainly that's and it may very well get worse. I mean, a lot of problems. I'm not saying that broadband is going to be like sort of the panacea or the silver bullet, but do you think that there's an adequate recognition in the legislature about that?
Well, I know I hear about it from almost everyone I talk to in upstate New York. And it's like, we don't say you're too far away from the power lines, you're not going to get electricity.
Right. Or sewer.
We make this the system is designed to make sure that everyone has access to that, what is now an essential element of doing business or education. As you said, the pandemic really highlights at a community scale what many individuals have dealt with for decades, not just broadband, but healthcare and so a lot of issues.
Any parting thoughts on broadband we touched on this, that and I can't remember, forgive me, which of you mentioned it, but there's this question of subsidization, right? So some people have taken it so far as to suggest, well, upstate should secede. There's a couple of pieces of legislation kicking around there, and then the question is, well, what would the economy be? Or would upstate be better because upstate sends more than it gets back, in terms of investment from a tax standpoint and the cost of doing business, et cetera. But so which is it in your opinion? I mean, is upstate subsidizing downstate? Is downstate subsidizing upstate? Is it neither? And if it's one of those two, what's the solution?
Right now in New York, the middle class is subsidizing the top.
There we go.
So most of the top lives in New York City. So that's the upstate downstate divide. Now, if the pandemic continues to play out or climate change happens and Manhattan ends up underwater, whatever next catastrophe we might have on the horizon and the rich folks decide to all move upstate, then, we're going to have that same divide, but the rich folks are just going to be living somewhere else.
Right.
What we need to address is the huge income disparity that we see right now. And it shows up in the digital divide that we were just talking about. And it shows up in every facet of New York State politics. The middle class is subsidizing the wealthy, and it's unsustainable. We can't keep that up.
Well, to play devil's advocate to that, people would say, well, you can't tax your way out of the problem, right? You can't, and even the governor, who of course is himself a Democrat, has said in the past, well, people will vote with their feet and people who are wealthy can afford to. So if you overtax the rich and make them pay too much, they're just going to leave and we need them in their disposable income.
I don't think anybody can argue.
That we pay.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Jim. Go ahead.
I would say we just want them all to pay the same percentage that we're paying. If they're paying the same amount that we pay through our paychecks and through earned income, I think, we would have, I think it would be pretty close to sufficient. And then the bigger discussion is going to be, how does that revenue get divvied up? I want it to offset the property tax burden.
I just think I thought of it. Is it the carried interest loophole?
Yep, that's one. There's several. I didn't bring.
I was like, what is it?
Out my plan.
No, it's okay. So who was next? Mr. Mannion, did I shut you down there?
I don't think so. I'll just say, in reference to the state structure, we have a fantastic state. New York City and the surrounding areas are a tremendous economic engine. And this state has been built, the institutions like Upstate Medical Center, or like the SUNY system that we have, or the excellent public schools that we have, that didn't happen by accident. It happened because we were an economic machine, and we continue to be. So, I mean, those conversations, I distance myself from them because they're just not realistic. We're not going to break up the SUNY system. That being said, if you look at the numbers, upstate benefits from downstate. We do, and we have to make sure that we get our fair share. Of course, we provide a lot to New York City, but this is a dynamic state, and there's a lot of economic growth that is occurring. Some would say it's happening greater in New York City than it is other places, and that's why that just is an argument for why you need people like the three of us in that conference to help make sure that our communities are benefiting from the dynamics of the state.
Well, and I don't want to cast aspersions on upstate, just to be clear, there's also legislation for Staten Island to secede. So, you're in good company, right? Just pointing that out.
And when you look at people leaving, I don't think anybody can make the argument that wealthy folks are living in New York State right now because it's a low tax state. Like that it's a low tax state. So they're living here for some other reason. They're living here because it's New York, right? I mean, this is a great, amazing state. They're not going to leave. They're not going to vote with their feet and walk out.
Well, okay.
Don't buy it.
So because we're going to come down to the end here, I want to actually just sort of wrap things off by playing off that and then give you all a chance to have sort of a final say. But, do you believe in the future of New York? I mean, look, you wouldn't be running for office to represent parts of New York if you didn't think that you believed in the future of New York. But, and certainly the death knell has been sounded before, and particularly in New York City. I mean, people are very concerned about if you can't get the subway back up and running, if you can't get the kids back into school, then you can't reopen the economy. Now we end where we started because we're back to the pandemic, which is really the overarching driver of every conversation, unfortunately. I mean, that's just the reality for the foreseeable future. But I guess in parting, if you would answer, do you believe in the future of New York and why? And then subsequently sort of close yourself out.
I'm ready to go. Here's why I'm running and why I believe it. I grew up here. Central New York has tremendous natural resources. It has more clean, fresh, accessible water than almost anywhere else in the world. It has A+ educational institutions. It is a transportation crossroads. We had our success. We knocked it out of the park in, the early 20th century, and we had to go through a transformation. We had to, because of the manufacturing jobs that we lost, and we did. When we talk about things like rural broadband, which also urban broadband is a problem as well, but when we talk about making sure that people want to live here, that our kids want to grow up here, I love where I'm from. It's a fantastic place. It's beautiful. It's got lots of great resources and great community institutions. And that's why I'm running. I'm running because I love my area. I think I've seen the successes, I've seen the failures, and I've seen, honestly, beyond failures, mistakes that were made because when we had the opportunity to jump on something, we maybe missed it. And sometimes we missed it just because we maybe didn't have the right people in the room. So I appreciate you taking the time, Liz and Jim and Leslie, for taking the time and allowing me to be a part of it. And I appreciate the discussion, which I think was a good one.
Thank you. My pleasure. Who wants to go next?
I will say, how can you not believe in the future of New York? I mean, we have so much to offer, as John was saying, but, I'm ready for this. I thrive on like identifying problems, working out solutions, bringing people together so the solutions benefit everyone. And, that's what's always driven me. The Commissioner of Agriculture will tell you, I love chaos. Because it gives you something really to work on.
Oh, you'll be perfect in Albany, Mr. Barber.
Yeah,
Great.
So, and just being able to work on solving problems. When I was in the USDA, head of the Farm Service Agency in New York, the first 2 years, they cut our budget 20%, cut our staff, cut our offices. We figured out how to deliver programs better, more efficiently, faster, with less resources. Just look at the issues, identify the problems, talk to the people who are dealing with those problems, and work out the solutions that help them. But it's being able to, find that common point that we all need to work toward.
Last word, ma'am.
Yeah, so I absolutely believe in the future of New York. I think we've got the greatest state in the nation here, and we've got all the resources we need to solve the problems that are in front of us. We just need to make sure that we give ourselves enough time. And I think that, we're in a pandemic right now that is 4 months old. And I think it is way too early to be forecasting the gloom and death of New York. Like that to me seems like you're giving up way too soon. So I'm in this to fight hard for my region that has been left behind for way too long. Young people have been leaving the southern tier of New York State in great quantities because they can't find a bright future here. The taxes are through the roof and there aren't jobs for people after they graduate. And we need to keep those resources here that we have invested years and years in building, just as, looking at the COVID pandemic and how we're going to build for the future. Let's don't throw away the vast resources that New York has to offer. So I think we've got all kinds of opportunity in front of us if we're smart about it, if we plan, if we get in there and have serious leadership that is going to think hard about these problems and how to solve them. But we're not going to be able to do it in a one-off. That's absolutely not the case. We're not going to be able to do it in anything that's going to look like a photo op, somebody who just wants a photo op. We need serious people. I think John and Jim and I, if we get into the legislature together, I think that we're going to be a force to be reckoned with. And I think that we can really take this by storm and make sure that we help New York get onto path for the future. And I'm excited about that.
Well, I want to thank you all for your participation in this conversation. It was supposed to be kitchen table, but I don't think any of us managed to make that happen. And if we had, you would have seen like chaos behind me, but Mr. Barber would have liked that. Apparently he's big into chaos. So thankfully I managed to keep the dog from barking out of control for an entire hour, which is a miracle. And I managed to get this almost timed to the minute. So that's awesome. I'm
impressed, Liz. It might be 20 years of experience.
It might be something like that. I'm used to people yelling at me, cut, which I don't have anybody doing that now. So I want to thank you all for participating. I just want to do sort of my soapbox PSA, which is that people really should participate because you don't have a voice unless you vote. So, and now I can say that, but I've always said that given my personal opinion about the democratic process. So I want to thank you for this opportunity to revisit my old self. And I want to thank those of you who are out there watching and participating in this conversation. And candidates, good luck to you. We'll talk soon.
And thanks to the citizen for hosting, and make sure to subscribe to your local paper.
Yeah, be well all.
Yeah.
Thank you.